Hello, Jerry here. Welcome back to the story of Esther. And what a story this is! There are 6 main characters. First came Queen Vashti of chapter 1, who was stripped of her crown for refusing to obey the summons of King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus. We didn't get much chance to know Vashti, but wow! In the opening event, she showed to all that she was a woman of great inner conviction, and willing to sacrifice her throne to preserve her dignity. Well, actually, she could not have known what price she would have had to pay for her stand. Apparently, it didn't matter. So in chapter 1, the book shares a story within a larger story, one that excites our imaginations. We wish we knew more. But this first story also serves to introduce both the majesty and grandeur and wealth of the Persian Empire. But also, not what we would expect with that, we observe the questionable character and bad decisions of King Xerxes, who probably won't be voted hubby of the year either. Through this story, we'll see how he depended on others to make royal decisions. A perfect target for our 4th character, the decisive but unscrupulous Haman. Haman won the king's complete approval and became the king's chief administrator, what we call a prime minister. Now, later in Persian Islamic history, this position was called a vizier. Haman did a lot of strutting through the capital, soaking up the homage of the population. That was a high priority with him, as we'll see. The next 2 characters are the Jewish exiles, Mordecai and Esther. Haman secured approval for a decree for the genocide of all the Jewish nation in exile because Mordecai refused to bow to him. We saw Esther and Mordecai urgently communicating back and forth through messages, and from these came these immortal sentences. First from Mordecai, "Who can say but that God has brought you into the palace for such a time as this?" Then from Esther, "Go and gather together all the Jews of Shushan," that's Susa, "and fast for me. Do not eat and drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my maids will do the same. And then, though it is strictly forbidden, I will go in to see the king, and if I perish, I perish." Okay, I said 6 main characters. So there's Vashti, Xerxes, Haman, Mordecai, and Esther. That's 5. Who is the final main character? Well, let me quote John MacArthur's Study Bible. "Whether he, that is the Lord, is named is not the issue. He is clearly the main character in the drama." Now we enter Chapter 5, where Queen Esther wasted no time doing what she had committed herself to do. On the 3rd day, that is, the 3rd day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. Here's approximately where she would have stood on the archaeological site of the palace, facing where the throne would have been. The caption reads, "The inner court of the king's palace." In this photo, the throne room is directly ahead, and one can picture what Esther saw as she prepared to approach the king. And as the caption says, we no longer see that big palace. Anyone approaching the throne walked on an upward incline, emphasizing the king's royal position above everyone else. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. This was the moment we've been holding our breath for. Notice she was standing in the court. She didn't barge into the throne room. Heavily armed soldiers stood behind the throne, ready to cut down anyone who entered without permission. By the way, try walking in uninvited to see an American president in the Oval Office. You will soon meet well-armed security guards. It has to be done. A critical phrase was that, quote, she won favor in his sight. Remember all the times this favor had been expressed toward Esther by everyone around her. Scripture shows how God blesses his people at times with favor from those around us. The Lord was with Joseph and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And then Nehemiah prayed, give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man, that is, King Artaxerxes. And certainly God's hand once more gave Esther favor in the eyes of the king. Imagine the wave of relief washing over Esther as she cleared this first enormous hurdle. She had access. The 17th century artist Bernardo Cavallino captured this dramatic moment in a painting from around 1645. Notice the king's positive response. And what gives this away? Well, notice his open, relaxed hand toward her, contrasted with her hand that is tense with fingers spread. And he leans toward her. And she also leans toward him, not looking down, but with some boldness meets his gaze. People of the court, or some of her servants, stand behind her, and two counselors on the king's left. I love all the shadows here, and even how that masks Esther's countenance. Wonderful restraint by the artist. Shadows indoors were their reality. They didn't have the indoor lighting we have. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you even to the half of my kingdom. The king was in a magnificent mood. He seemed to be touched by her entrance. He knew the queen had an important request approaching him like that. Now to the plan she had devised during those 3 days of fasting. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Part of this plan, should she live, included this feast on the very same day, which means she would have already instructed her servants to purchase and prepare all this food. In the ancient world, most food was purchased the day you consumed it. No royal refrigerators in the palace. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. The king was still in high spirits. Then Esther answered, my wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. The main request of Esther was not for 2 feasts. The king was playing along with the queen about when this request would be voiced. So the queen desired to make this request at a second feast her servants would cater, which again included Prime Minister Haman. A very bold move, don't you think? Haman has the king's ear and favor. We'd think he would be the last person invited, so that the queen could explain everything to the king without Haman's charming and influential presence. But let's trust Esther. She knows what she's doing. We don't know why Queen Esther delayed and went for a second feast, perhaps to heighten the suspense, or did she lose her nerve at the first feast? We don't know. But she could not have anticipated what actions Haman would take between these 2 feasts. Actions many of us remember well. Then the story pivots to focus on Haman after this second feast invitation. And Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Hundreds were bowing and prostrating themselves before Haman as he made his rounds. But he was such a narcissist that one individual refusing to praise him ruined his entire day. I guess it's human nature to focus only on what is missing, not the many things right. And as you look at this 1,000-piece puzzle, what are you especially looking at? Well, 999 pieces perfectly in place. But that missing piece commands our attention, doesn't it? Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Haman probably wasn't accustomed to restraining himself, but he had already published the decree, and it would only be a matter of time before Mordecai was gone. Now he's heading home, where his family and friends will rally to his side. And he, that is Haman, sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Well, the worship service continued at home, didn't it? Then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I'm invited by her together with the king." Well, it couldn't be better. He was on a mountaintop experience. But yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. The praise of Haman must be complete. His control over people must be absolute, without exception. This is when his wife and friends stepped in with some sage advice to cheer Haman. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. 3 parts to this scheme. First, build a gallows 75 feet high. That's 6 or 7 stories tall. There was already a gallows used against the conspirators in chapter 2. Yeah, but that was too ordinary for Haman. This had to be extravagant and theatrical. By the way, the Persian gallows was not for hanging as we think of it, with a rope around the neck. To the Persians, hanging meant impaling. A person's executed or mortally wounded body was impaled on poles or walls, visible to the public. The second part, go in the morning and tell the king to hang Mordecai on it. The king would certainly approve. If Haman could secure the execution of all of a nation in exile there, he could certainly be allowed to execute one person for clear violations of law. We should understand that this public and unusually extravagant execution served to exalt Haman even more. People would ask, what did this person do against the state to deserve such a huge, towering gallows visible across the city? Well, the response would be, he disrespected Haman. Can you see how all the extra trouble of building this massive public structure would send the royal message, never disrespect Prime Minister Haman? And as we'll see, it was built right alongside Haman's house. Now the third part of their scheme. Then you can go cheerfully to that evening feast, with the queen and the king topping off a capital day. All that probably would have succeeded without a hitch, were it not for an occurrence of something we always hate. The king got insomnia. Insomnia is so frustrating, isn't it? And if that happens to you with any regularity, you probably have your pet strategies to get back to sleep. Well, the king had a great strategy. Chapter 6. On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. So a servant or royal librarian, the job I would want there, he read the Chronicles, the annals of the various activities around the nation. Now, the king had reigned about 12 years by now. That's a lot to choose from in the annals. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." It so happened the Persian librarian read the story of Mordecai foiling that assassination plot. Now, how long ago did that incident happen? According to chapter 2, Mordecai's action probably was in the 7th year of his reign. Chapter 2, verse 16. But the last timestamp we've seen was chapter 3, verse 7 in the 12th year. So, about 5 years down the road. So 12 years of Chronicles for his reign, and an entry 5 years ago was read to the king. The book of Esther is filled with these many connected events by a divine orchestrator. And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Remember, this was surely a slam dunk for Haman, a relatively unimportant employee. The king would so easily delegate this to Haman. It's just who Xerxes was. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now, had King Xerxes read the room, he would have realized that he had before him a man who could only imagine the following. And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" Scripture enlightens and treats us to the inner recesses of Haman's soul. How would Haman like to be honored by the king, even beyond the lavish honor Haman extracts from the people daily on his rounds? So what would be his highest delight? It's as if he rubbed a Persian magic lamp, and the genie is granting him a wish. And Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" True to form, Xerxes lets others make his decisions and work out the details. Haman creates an elaborate way to honor someone, no doubt disguising and being coy about what Haman thinks he knows. Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." Well, for the first time in this story, the tide turns against Haman, with the exception of Mordecai's resistance. Haman does not get what he came for, the public hanging of Mordecai. Nor does Haman receive those honors he crafted with himself in mind. But what Haman does get are orders to parade Mordecai around in the resplendent honor of Haman's own invention, the very thing Haman had lusted for himself. Haman receives the excruciating pain of being utterly humbled. The Dutch artist Rembrandt captured this very moment around 1660. Notice the full title, Haman Prepares to Honor Mordecai. Haman is in front, his eyes closed, and he is suffering great anguish in his heart, with his hand over his heart, with the humble-looking Mordecai behind him on our left, along with King Xerxes on our right. It's interesting, both of them have their heads angled about the same degree, in different mindsets than Haman. The king was still clueless of any problem, and Mordecai, does he want to be paraded around in splendor? Probably not. He doesn't look excited. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. I love that. Mordecai just went back to work at the gate. Enough of that nonsense. As for Haman, he used a sick day and went home. Not only was Mordecai lavishly honored, but it had to be expressed from Haman's own mouth. For a Jew, Haman hated with every fiber of his being. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. Well, a little wisdom finally emerges from Haman's wife and the counselors. Had the conversation been allowed to continue, they surely would have mentioned the 75-foot gallows built for the now honored Mordecai. Nor was there any admission and apology that the former advice to build the gallows was a bit untimely. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. Well, at least there was the feast to cheer Haman. And Haman had not yet asked the king about hanging Mordecai, so maybe there was still time to claim the gallows were for someone else. Now, let me add in epilogue, the verse that made the biggest impression on me in this lesson was when the king had favor upon his queen when she entered. And that after 3 days of prayer and fasting, we think. Everything proceeded from then. Maybe we should pray more for God to give us favor in the eyes of those around us, including a lot of people you want to influence for good. I think it's a great prayer request, and also to pray this for those close to you, that they will enjoy favor with those around them. This is something I do concerning my family, my employers, and even with you all in my Sunday school class. I need God's favor on me here to help me, Jerry, an imperfect sinner, to not be distracting you from learning and growth. The Lord gave Esther favor, so that the king thought well of her and received her, and he didn't become critical or spiteful because he had not invited her that day, as he was capable of doing. Well, next week, Lord willing, the big reveal in chapter 7. Thanks very much.